So the title of my presentation, it's slightly different than I think what you have in the program. I will certainly discuss the work of the high-level expert group, the piloting phase, and what's going on with that. But you see, I added a slightly different title where I say AI between ethics and law. And I think that really captures where we stand right now. So I work on both ethical and legal issues of AI, and with the high-level expert group that I used to coordinate, we focused a lot on the ethical aspects, but we are starting to move now more into the legal realm. Not to say that there are not already laws applicable to AI, of course, but we see that the ethical guidelines, for instance, that the high-level expert group came up with, and more generally, ethical issues around AI are starting to transform, or we're starting to think to which extent do we now need to put them into law. So that's why I just wanted to draw your attention to that title as a sort of introduction. So what I'm going to do in the next 30 so minutes, and then we'll try to foresee enough time for questions, is to try to take you on this journey that we've been through, saying, okay, we have AI that is more and more ubiquitous everywhere. It's used more and more. There are benefits, there are risks. And what do we do with that, right? How do we tackle these? What is the thinking behind it? And what is the role that fundamental rights, as we call them in the European Union, play in that? So I'll take you through that journey, and then we'll foresee enough time for questions. So I always like to remember some of the metaphors that people use with AI. They're being very creative nowadays. So AI is a double-edged sword, the positive and the negative, or it's two sides of the coin, or the Roman god Janus with his two heads. So, and this is not unique to AI, of course, right? With all technologies, you have positive effects and negative effects, and that's why it's also not neutral as such. It depends how human beings use it, but also how they design and program it. Because this already is embedded into some ethical values from the start. And that's something that we are starting to be more and more aware of. Now, the more we make things smart, the more we incorporate AI and smart technology into our daily lives, from smart fridges, smart cars, smart industries, smart pacifiers. The latest I saw was a smart condom. To, in general, smart cities, obviously the risks that come with it are exacerbated, right? They're more frequent, they're more part of our lives, so we need to tackle them as well. Yes, there are benefits, but the more we do this, the more we need to prepare for the risks as well. So what is then the start of our journey? What do lawmakers, what do policymakers need to do with that? Because we expect action from them, and we expect them to take the right action. So what we want them to do is ensure that AI is used for good. At least that it's not used for bad. Ideally that it's used for good and doesn't do any harm. But it brings us to a philosophical question. What is good? And it's not a very easy question to solve. And philosophers have been trying to get an answer to that for centuries and didn't manage. And from your point of view, that will influence what you consider as good. I've put here some examples of ethical theories that influence the answer to that question. And I'm not even talking about cultural differences, because a virtue ethicist who lives in different countries might also culturally have different ideas about that. So that raises a fear that what is good is ethically relative, ethical relativism as we call it, meaning that maybe there's no such thing as an absolute good. Maybe it's all relative, maybe it all depends. But if that is true, then we have a problem. Because policymakers need a definition of good, or need to work towards good AI policies that are accepted by their constituents. And the second thing is that the problems that we encounter with AI don't stop at the border. Right? There are a lot of cross-border issues with AI, so ideally the policies that you adopt in order to counter that harm also tackles harm across border, or at least is done in a cooperative manner. So that brings us to the fact that ideally we need a definition of good AI, or we need good AI policies that are accepted universally. So we don't want ethical relativism. We want a morally absolute or morally universal definition of good AI. That is the thinking, that is our quest, basically. The quest is this: how can we get a definition of good AI, get a definition of what it means to go towards good AI policies, to make sure that almost everyone accepts them, a large group as possible accepts them, without saying, oh, in my country we see things completely differently. So that is our quest. Now, what was the response of states? First of all, you've probably seen a proliferation of national AI strategies. You already heard of some of them. And if you look at the language of these strategies, it's very interesting to analyze it. They're all already the leader in AI, Europe, China, US, and they all want to maintain their leadership through their strategies. There's a very nice quote from Putin that kind of sums up what's at stake. And basically, the role that regulation can play in all of that has started to become more important because we already have this race to AI. Right? Each region, each country wants to be the best at developing new AI technologies, deploying them, wants to invest in AI, wants to boost the uptake in industry, in public sector. At the same time, we mentioned we have the harms. Plus, we also realize that regulation can actually be used to stimulate innovation. If you have legal certainty, people might also be more prone to innovate. That means that regulation is increasingly becoming important in this field. So, I argue there is not just a race to AI, there is also a race to AI regulation. And if you see the statements of some of these, strategies that now go beyond just, boosting investments in AI, but also say we want to be the first to come up with a law on AI, and Europe is one of those regions, then you see that there is a bit of a race to AI regulation because there is a first mover advantage. If you're the first to come with regulation, you can be the standard setter. And then the others will have to adapt their products to you. That's the philosophy behind it. Of course, there are voices that say, if you don't have the technology to start with, you can make all the rules as you want, but nobody will adhere to them. So the truth is in the middle, right? But that's the situation where we are. Now, looking at the EC approach particularly, because that's what I helped working on when I was still working at the Commission. Background, there was a strategy, European AI, published in 2018, based on the 3 pillars that you probably already heard of a lot. But so, in a nutshell, boosting AI uptake, tackling socio-economic impact, so especially impact on jobs, which is more of a member state issue actually than the EU competence. And then the last one, which is the most important now for our talk today, ensuring an adequate ethical and legal framework for AI. Again, this is not to say that there is no legal framework out there whatsoever, but it's rather to see to which extent is it adequate enough? To which extent do we need to supplement it with additional legislation? And it's in that context that the European Commission also set up a high-level expert group on AI that I coordinated. Now, about this group, you see that it's relatively diverse, so there were stakeholders from civil society organizations, academia, business, by the way, also from different backgrounds. So when I talk about academia, it's not just computer scientists, but also philosophers, lawyers, labor scientists, so a bit of everything. Their mandate consisted of coming up with 2 deliverables: ethics guidelines for trustworthy AI and policy and investment recommendations. Guidelines are meant for AI practitioners, so those who are developing and deploying the technology. So it's really practical guidance as to what should I do if I want to make sure that the AI that I'm developing or that I'm using is more or less in line with ethics. And the second document, the policy recommendations, were actually meant for the Commission itself and for member states. And they say, what are the policies that we need to adopt, also beyond just non-binding guidelines, to make sure that we have good AI, basically. And then there is the European AI Alliance. I don't know how many of you know of the European AI Alliance? Any of you member of the Alliance? No? Okay, well, you can Google it. It's you can become a member very fast. It doesn't cost you anything. And it's a very good way to stay up to date with the latest developments of Commission policy in this field, because you get regular updates there. Plus, the high-level expert group also asked for feedback from members of the Alliance. So now they're, for instance, also developing policy around specific sectors. They'll reach out to the Alliance and ask for information from members of the Alliance to get their point of view. So it's a good forum to be on if you're interested in that. So moving now to the ethics guidelines, what came out of this group of 52 quite diverse experts? First of all, the human-centric approach to AI, which I have to say is not unique to Europe. If you compare the guidelines, for instance, of Japan and of other countries, you also see this human-centric approach coming forward. But what in Europe is meant with that is that AI should never be seen as an end in itself. It's a tool. It's a tool that is used for the end of itself, which are human beings, which is a very Kantian idea, very linked to the idea of human dignity, right? So AI is a tool. We don't develop it just because it's cool. We develop it because we believe that it can bring value to individuals and society as a whole. Now, how did they overcome this ethical relativism that I was talking about, right? All these different ethical views. Well, they said, well, in fact, in Europe, we already have a sort of ethical basis that we all agree on, that is actually already enshrined in a charter, fundamental European rights, and that is already part of international human rights law as well. Those are human rights. So instead of going to look through ethical theories and say, should we do it more utilitarian or more Kantian, they went to these fundamental rights and they used that as a basis. And a lot of people said it's a very good idea because it's something that is already established. So, and fundamental rights play a dual role here. Because in many countries, they're legally enforceable, right? You can go to court and claim compensation if you feel that one of your fundamental rights has been infringed. However, in some countries, they're not, or in some situations, they're not. We know that, for instance, the Charter of Fundamental Rights only applies to EU institutions and to member states when they implement EU law, not in other circumstances. Nevertheless, in those circumstances, you can still see fundamental rights as sort of moral entitlements that we have by mere virtue of us being human beings, even if you cannot go to court and make it into hard law. So that's why they play a very important role in the guidelines of the expert group. Rather than stating ethical AI and how we should advance ethical AI, the expert group used the term trustworthy AI. And trustworthy AI consists of three things. First of all, it should be lawful. Because the first thing they said is there is already legislation out there. You cannot call yourself ethical, or your AI cannot be trustworthy if you don't, first of all, comply with the legal rules that exist, or that will exist. So first of all, you need to ensure your AI is lawful. Second, it needs to be ethical, so it needs to comply with ethical principles and values. And third, very importantly, it also needs to be robust, specifically from a technical point of view. Because let's say I can easily hack it, or there are data leaks, then it's also not very trustworthy. And you have a responsibility as a developer or deployer to make sure that that's also taken into account. So what I did then is I looked at basically the 5 families of fundamental rights that you'll also find in the EU Charter. That was the base layer. And based on that, they then derived 4 ethical principles. And you see those are relatively abstract, broad principles that should always be taken into account in an AI context. Right? So respect for human autonomy, especially since we know that the purpose of AI is to take over some tasks from human beings to make it easier, but that can have an impact on human autonomy. Prevention of harm, which we already talked about a lot. Fairness in how these systems are developed and used. And explicability. One step of concreteness further, on these principles, they then derived 7 key requirements that AI systems should meet. So you see, it becomes a bit more concrete. 7 requirements. If we want to respect human autonomy, we need to ensure human agency and oversight. Right? What kind of oversight mechanisms did you put in place in order to make sure that your AI system respects human autonomy? You need to put in place technical robustness mechanisms and safety mechanisms. Otherwise, you can still have harm. You need to ensure that you respect privacy, and not just privacy and data protection, but also data governance. Data governance goes beyond data protection. It means you also need to look at the quality of your data, the integrity of your data, because garbage in, garbage out. If your data is not good, your AI system's decisions won't be any good. Transparency is a very important requirement, and you'll see it also comes back now in the Commission's white paper. I'll get to that later. Transparency consists of 3 sub-requirements. Traceability, so trying to make your decisions as traceable as possible. Explainability, so especially if there is an impact on an individual human being, you need to be able to explain at least the logic of that decision. Why is such an explanation needed? Otherwise, the individual cannot challenge it. Right? An explanation then makes it challengeable. That's why judges need to motivate their judgments. Otherwise, you cannot challenge it. And the third element of this transparency is communication. we need to ensure proper communication of the limitations and capabilities of the AI system so that people have the right expectations when they use these systems and don't think, oh, this is autonomous, so I can just fall asleep in a car and nothing happens. And that's when accidents happen, in fact, right? Diversity, non-discrimination, and fairness. I'm sure you've already heard a lot about bias in AI, so that's a big one to tackle. But also just universal design, making sure that everyone, also those with a disability, can have access to that technology. Societal and environmental well-being. There is an impact on society, also on our social interactions with each other, and of course on the environment. There are a lot of AI systems, especially if it's based on deep learning. It's a huge energy consumption that is behind it, so it's something we need to take into account. And then accountability, last but not least. So make yourself accountable for the development and use of your AI systems. That means make your system auditable, so that we can go and check if something happened that should not have happened. Document any negative consequences that your AI system can have, so that you can take care of that. Now, all of these requirements are explained in much more details in the ethics guidelines, which I think was part of your background, and otherwise you'll find it online. So if you're interested to find out more about that, you can read about it there. And then maybe the most important thing, this is not supposed to be a checklist that you look at after you finish developing your AI system to say, oh, did I take this into account? Yes, no. From the very design phase of the system onwards, you need to look at these. Because you can incorporate a lot of these things, or you need to incorporate them into the design phase of your system. So that's very important to keep in mind throughout the entire life cycle of the AI system. Now, to operationalize these 7 requirements, the expert group then made an assessment list. Right? This assessment list consists of a lot of practical questions, too many if we hear a lot of people. On the other hand, it's very difficult to know how many questions should we include, because they might be relevant, how many questions might not be relevant for your specific AI application. So the idea is that it's up to each developer and deployer to tailor the assessment list to their AI application based on the risks related to their sector or use case. A piloting process was launched from July to December in order to collect feedback on this assessment list, to understand, do these questions make sense? Are they clear enough? What can be improved? And there was feedback was gathered through an online survey. We did in-depth interviews with about 50 organizations, private and public, to really, dig deeper into what do we need to improve. And there was continuous feedback through the European AI Alliance, which I already mentioned, the platform. And so the idea is, on the basis of the feedback that was received, to have a revised assessment list ready by June. Now, we were supposed to have a meeting earlier this week, which got cancelled because of reasons that you can imagine. So we'll have to see. Hopefully we can maintain that timeline. But in principle, we're still aiming to have a revised assessment list ready by June, mid-June, something like that. And then, of course, this also forms the basis for the follow-up steps by the European Commission. So before I go to that, let me just draw your attention to the second document that the high-level expert group delivered, because it's a bit less known than the ethics guidelines, but it's becoming more and more relevant now that we go more into the policy realm. So first of all, in their policy recommendations, the expert group said, let's take a risk-based approach to AI, and let's avoid overly prescriptive regulation. We might need new regulation, however, at least in order to tackle critical concerns. So there was some criticism that the high-level expert group only promulgated non-binding guidelines and that they thought no legislation is needed, and there was some criticism of ethics washing, but it's not really justified because there was a second document. So it's not okay to just ignore that second document that says we need legislation, of course. Refrain from mass surveillance of individuals, and this counts both for private and public surveillance, so they were very strict about that. I'm just putting some bullet points here. The document is 30 pages full of recommendations, but just to give you some takeaways. Procurement rules were also highlighted as something where the EU could already step in. Because if you ensure that in the procurement rules of member states, then can only procure AI that is trustworthy, that meets certain requirements, you already catalyze a more trustworthy use of AI automatically. Children were indicated as an extremely vulnerable group that extra measures need to be taken there. And then beyond just substantive rules, we also need to see whether the competences and capacities of enforcers are sufficient. And then for AI systems that have a significant impact on human lives or can interfere with fundamental rights, here it comes back, our fundamental rights, or safety critical obligations, they proposed at least to take into consideration a mandatory obligation to conduct a fundamental rights impact assessment, so that each deployer and developer of an AI system needs to go over the fundamental rights and say, how can this system have an impact on those rights? How can I remedy that impact from the start, before it's marketed? Conduct stakeholder consultations, because as a developer, there's only so much you know. You don't know how those who will use the technology will feel about it, or what their concerns are. And then traceability, auditability, and where needed, ex ante oversight mechanisms. So that's already pretty far going. And then, of course, last but not least, the availability of redress. So these were some of the recommendations that the expert group made. And if you then put that next to the white paper of the European Commission, so as you know, there were leaders that increasingly called, or I'll put now 2 German ladies there, but there were a lot of leaders actually calling for AI regulation. And that regulation sought most of all to safeguard fundamental rights, because that is the risk called out by a lot of European leaders. How can we safeguard fundamental rights? So if we go back to our quest, to the beginning of our story, we were looking for an ethical framework of how to deal with AI, how to ensure good AI systems, right? In that search, we then identified fundamental rights as a sort of base layer that we can use, because it's already widely accepted, and because we wanted to counter ethical relativism that said, oh no, it's all relative. No, this is something that could be absolute. On the basis of those fundamental rights, the expert group then came up with ethical principles. But if we now go a step further, we see that leaders are calling beyond these ethical principles to try to ensure that we safeguard fundamental rights. So we made a kind of U-turn, right? We come again back at fundamental rights and how we can protect them, and how ethical principles could form an inspiration of further protection of these fundamental rights. What are the virtues of a fundamental rights-based framework? It's well established, especially in the EU, where you also know that it's legally enforceable, at least in certain circumstances, and where you don't have the charter applicable, you of course have a lot of national constitutions that safeguard certain fundamental rights. It seems to be sufficiently broad to capture also the novel risks related to AI, because fundamental rights are usually formed as a sort of principle, right? Not as a prescriptive rule. So you can adapt them, you can make them malleable to also include new risks that you did not encounter yet. It's open to renewed interpretation also by the judiciary. As Dan already mentioned, I mean, you can go to court and make your case. And in the absence of secondary legislation that gives you more protection, this is the way to do it. These fundamental rights already apply today. We don't need to take any further steps to make them applicable also to AI. So we can already claim those rights today. And that's something that people sometimes tend to forget because they see that there is a sort of legal vacuum. And there are existing enforcement mechanisms which we can use. However, and those are the critics then of using a fundamental rights-based approach, they say, well, these rights are not really universal, they're kind of Western. So maybe they could work for Europe, but they could not work for a global approach. People also say they are too narrow, and it's again something that Dan already pointed out. Primarily, they apply in vertical context, right? You can claim fundamental rights from your governments. It's still very difficult to claim them horizontally. But who produces AI products? It's mostly private companies, private organizations, not public. So we need to find mechanisms to ensure that even if it's a private organization that produces it, you can still claim fundamental rights from them. It's starting to change slowly. It's moving now from vertical more and more into horizontal, but we're not there yet. Are they able to deal with tensions? You need to balance rights out, right? So that is also something that might be an obstacle. And then the question is also, are they not too individualistic? Can they also take into account the societal impact? Are there tensions between individual fundamental rights, harm to an individual, versus benefits for society? I personally might not like to give up healthcare information that is private to me, but in fact, if we would all give up some medical information, we might advance much more in AI for diagnosis of rare diseases, for instance. So there's a tension between the individual and the society that we see there. And the question, are they not too abstract? Because it depends how they're interpreted, right? The strength of their abstract nature is that you can mold them to the specific use case, right? They apply to a lot of different situations. But because of their abstract nature, people can interpret them in different ways. Kind of depends sometimes on the judge. So, however, if we go back to our quest, this is the picture, the last picture that I left you with. There is more than just this, because there is also secondary legislation that concretizes fundamental rights, where they are too abstract. Think of the fundamental right to data protection. We have a GDPR in place and the Law Enforcement Directive, for instance. So even if you say, well, these fundamental rights are too abstract to go to court and make your case, which you can still do, there is already legislation in place. And the phase where we are now is to have a look and say, do we need additional secondary legislation to concretize these fundamental rights? That is now the question. And it's not a new question. Because if I put here the 7 requirements for trustworthy AI, I put some examples of secondary legislation that already exists today that covers that, partially at least. Not fully, but partially. So this is the exercise we need to start doing. Seeing to which extent are these fundamental rights too abstract to give us the protection we need for the AI context? Where do we need secondary legislation that concretizes these rights? And where don't we have sufficient secondary legislation? Yeah? So there is no legal vacuum that's supposed to be a legal vacuum, but there are legal gaps. Right? And we are in the stage where we're trying to see how can we bridge those gaps? How should we bridge them? Which directives, regulations, which principles do we need to put into secondary legislation? And a final note on the white paper now, you see that it builds on the work of the high-level expert group. Also to mention, it came also with a European data strategy. So it was not just AI, also data was mentioned, but separately. I don't know if that was the best idea. And it rests on 2 building blocks. Creating an ecosystem of excellence. So again, boosting innovation, boosting the uptake. AI is great, AI has benefits. And an ecosystem of trust. Meaning, yes, we know there might be harm, so we need to take that into account. Basically, translation. It repeats the 7 requirements for trustworthy AI. So it explicitly acknowledges them, builds on that. But it also says, in addition, we might need new regulation. Right? That's basically what they say. And the 2 main risks that are identified in that document, fundamental rights, especially data protection and non-discrimination, but also safety and liability. Risk-based and not overly prescriptive. So that was something that also the expert group mentioned. And to focus on high-risk applications, you might know there is a double criterion used, right? One is it a risky sector? And then within that sector, is the use case particularly riskful? I leave it an open question to you, and the Commission actually leaves it an open question to all of us whether this is the right way to go. And then there are requirements that would mandatorily apply. And if you put them together with the guidelines, there is a lot of overlap, right? Traceability, auditability, explainability, data quality. So you see that coming back. There is a lot of inspiration there from the guidelines, which is good. But then the big question, I would say the €1 million question, is the enforcement mechanism. Because you have a beautiful white paper that details, in a lot of pages, traceability, explainability, facial recognition, and then enforcement is this little chapter, but it's the most important chapter, of course. Because how are you going to actually enforce ex-ante mechanisms? How are you going to check before a product can come to the market that it complies with all these things? And bear in mind, checking compliance with safety, with technical things, is something entirely different than checking compliance with fairness or bias. There's not one test to check whether an AI system is biased. Sometimes it's very important that a distinction is made between men and women, for instance. It depends on the context. There is not one-size-fits-all test that you can do here. But there is a public consultation, and in fact they changed it. It's not until the 19th of May, it's now until the 31st of May, because the consultation was not available in all languages for the first 2 weeks. So if you're interested, if you have ideas, do take part, because it's important to make our voices heard. I have 2 more slides. Am I still okay on time? Okay, good. So maybe just to point out some of the difficulties that the Commission and policymakers are facing now. There's not one AI. The way we talk about AI is often a bit misleading. There's no such thing as one AI. AI is an umbrella term of a lot of different applications and techniques. And as lawyers, we don't always understand that. It's also not a very easy technology to understand, but it's important to get this right. Within AI, and I'm now doing really an oversimplification, the 2 main techniques that you have are rule-based AI systems and learning-based AI systems. And the most problematic systems are those who raise the most ethical questions, because there is the least control of what the AI system does, are deep learning AI systems. And you see they belong to the learning-based AI category. If you have a rule-based system, a lot is programmed, a lot is codified. So you have much more control over how the system acts, which data it looks into. So automatically this has an impact on the ethical issues that arise from it. And then robotics adds a new dimension, right? A robotic system which has a hardware component can have rule-based AI incorporated in it. It can have learning-based AI. It can be a hybrid system taking from both, because the distinction is not very rigid either. But it can also have no AI whatsoever and be, a very stupid robot, which works on very basic algorithms. So we cannot just treat that as, oh, it's all the same thing. That's why I have still some doubts about an AI-specific regulation. I think the approach might be better to have technology-neutral regulation. Again, depending on what the risk is that you want to take into account. Because if you have unethical behavior, it doesn't matter whether it's a fancy AI system, whether it's a very basic algorithm, or whether it's a human being that is responsible for it. However, AI-specific regulation might make sense for those impacts that are AI-specific, right? For features that are only there with AI and not with other technologies. But that is now the exercise that needs to be done. Are there those features? And what kind of risks do they perpetuate? Then, of course, there are many different sectors. So it does make sense that the Commission says, well, we should look at the impact of different sectors, right? An AI system that recommends a song doesn't have the same impact as an AI system that recommends a medical diagnosis. But again, what do you do when you have a very basic algorithm that you don't call AI? Or when it's advanced statistics that is not technically speaking AI? You probably read some of the articles that state that a lot of, especially startups, but companies in general in Europe, lie about the fact that they use AI. And they do that to attract investments, obviously. Now, what we don't want is to come into a situation where people lie about not using AI because they don't want to fall under the AI regulation. I mean, that's something we need to think about, right? So that's why I'm saying it's important to look at what is the risk, what is the harm that is problematic to us. And then sure, it can be perpetuated by an AI system, but maybe also by a human being, by a basic algorithm, by a statistical system. We need to take all of that into account, not just if it has the label AI, because that changes all the time, what we call AI. So to conclude, I do believe that fundamental rights can offer a very good basis to try to assess for us, where do we want to go? What do we consider good AI? What kind of AI do we want to incentivize? And what do we don't want? However, there are some challenges that I'm pointing out here. Where are we happy? With ethical guidelines, with guidance, with trying to figure out what is the best approach here before we put something into hard regulation? And where do we say, no, we need already regulation now, or in a few years when we understand better the impact? Where do we go for a horizontal approach, like the GDPR? Or where do we go for sector-specific regulation? We already have a lot of sector-specific regulation, for instance, in terms of safety. Where do we go for technology neutral rules, or where do we go for AI specific regulation? Not just because politically it sounds fancy to have AI regulation, but because it really makes sense. Where do we go for a local approach? So national rules, EU rules, or where do we try to find global consensus? Because remember, cross-border effects also of the harm. How do we balance out protection and innovation? And I would say we shouldn't make too much of a dichotomy between them. We need to ensure that our innovation includes protection. And how can we keep pace with technological developments, right? So we need a public debate on how to bridge those gaps, on the roles that we want AI systems to have in our society. And so in terms of practical next steps, you need to watch out for the revised assessment list of the high-level expert group, which again, non-binding, and for an EC legislative proposal, which is very likely to come after the feedback has been processed of the white paper's consultation. I'll stop here. Thank you.